Welcome back to RameyWorks 360. Most military dioramas focus on combat, explosions, and hero moments. But honestly, that's not what I remember most from the Army. What I remember was the downtime. Living out of the back of the Stryker, sleeping in the dirt, drinking Black Rifle coffee, waiting for missions. And somehow, even while one crew was working the mortar, two guys nearby sitting on ammo crates, pooping in bags, myself and my buddy Chris. So, for this build, I wanted to recreate what life in an MCV crew actually felt like during NTC. First, I cut my base. It's going to be 18 by 18 out of pink insulation foam, along with a few other pieces for the hill. After my pieces are cut, I start laying things out to really start getting a feel for the area and then the placement of all the things. Once I'm sure of the positioning of everything, I use tacky glue to secure everything in place. I try and find heavy things to weigh the pieces down while they dry. Once dry, I carve and shape the hill to my liking. For the terrain, I wanted that dry Mojave hard-packed look you see all over NTC. Not just flat tan dirt, but layered terrain with dust, compact earth, gravel, and sun-bleached sand. I used AK's dry ground first to build texture. As simple as this terrain might seem, this is honestly one of the most important parts of the entire build. Because before the vehicle, before the figures, the gear, the environment has to feel believable. And if you've ever been to NTC, you know exactly what this terrain looks like. Dry, hard-packed dirt, layers of dust, rock everywhere, and that fine, powdery sand that somehow gets into absolutely everything. So, for the base layer, I started with AK dry ground texture paste. I worked it from the top of the berm down toward the vehicle area, building up uneven surfaces and natural erosion. I didn't want perfectly smooth terrain. Real desert environments have cracks, hard edges, compacted areas, and loose, dusty sections where vehicles and soldiers constantly move through. It was time to start adding one of the most important layers, the desert sand. This step completely changed how the base looked. Up until this point, it still kind of felt like painted terrain, but the second I started sprinkling the sand across the surface, it immediately started feeling like NTC. I tried to focus heavier buildup around the camp areas, the lower sections of the berm, and the open ground where dust would naturally collect over time. But I also wanted to avoid making everything uniform in color, because real desert terrain has contrast. After that, I started adding some larger rocks and gravel using crushed cat litter. This ended up working way better than I expected. One thing about NTC terrain is it's never just smooth sand. You constantly see broken rock, gravel, hard pack, and scattered debris all over the place, especially around berms and vehicle positions where erosion and traffic expose the rougher terrain underneath. I tried to focus them in more natural areas, like along the base of the berm, around the terrain transitions, and I scattered it through some of the terrain along the ground. Once the rocks and gravel were where I wanted them, I needed a way to lock everything in place before moving on to the next layer. So I grabbed some Mod Podge Ultramatte spray and started misting the entire terrain down. I was a little nervous during this step, because if you spray too heavily, you can completely ruin the texture, flatten the sand, or shift all the gravel around. So instead of soaking the terrain, I used light mist coats from further back and slowly sealed everything in place. Next, I started adding AK's sandy desert texture, and this layer was really important because this is what started giving the terrain that dry, dusty NTC look. Instead of covering the entire base evenly, I mainly focused the sandy desert around the tops of the berms, the front slopes, the troop area, and the section where the Stryker would eventually sit. While the sandy desert layer was drying, I shifted over to working on some of the smaller camp details. These little human elements are what really help bring a scene like this to life. So I started painting the camping chairs. I went with one blue chair and one red chair because it instantly adds some visual contrast against the dusty tan terrain and military green elements. Now, after getting the base colors down, I dry brushed the metal legs with gunmetal gray to bring out some of the edges and give them more worn metallic appearance. It's a small detail, but it really goes a long way. Next, I started adding Vallejo desert sand texture to help blend everything together and create that fine, dusty buildup you would see all over NTC. I mainly focused around the areas where sand would naturally collect over time, so I concentrated heavier buildup around the troop area, on the top of the berms, along the front slopes, and especially where the Stryker was eventually going to sit. Once all the terrain textures were finally in place, I started tying everything together with the airbrush using Iraqi sand. This is one of my favorite stages during the desert build because this is where the terrain stops looking like separate layers and starts feeling like one environment. I used Iraqi sand as more of a dust filter than an actual paint layer. After the Iraqi sand pass, I loaded up the airbrush with buff to start building in some of the lighter sun-bleached, highlighted areas across the terrain. Instead of spraying straight across the entire base, I mainly focused on upper surfaces, the tops of the berms, the higher ridges, the exposed rocks, and the areas where sun would naturally hit the hardest. The final color I would airbrush would be deck tan. I used this very lightly across the highest points of the terrain, the tops of the berms, and the sharp edges. The goal here was to create that final sun-faded effect you'd see out in the Mojave Desert after constant heat and exposure. At NTC, everything eventually gets bleached out by the sun. After finishing most of the terrain, I started working on some of the smaller equipment details to help make the scene feel more lived in. For this part, I grabbed Tamiya's modern US military equipment set and started picking through some of the gear pieces that I thought would fit the atmosphere of the diorama. Even though the kit is definitely more late 90s to early 2000s era equipment, a lot of the soft gear still works surprisingly well for modern field environment. Once all the major terrain colors were finished, I went back with a little dry brushing, using Iraqi sand to help pull some of the smaller details and textures across the base. I switched over to buff for the final highlights across the terrain. Compared to Iraqi sand, the buff has a much lighter, almost chalky tone to it, which worked perfectly for simulating areas that had been completely blasted by the desert sun. The goal wasn't to turn everything bright tan, just to catch the highest textures and create subtle contrast across the scene. Next, I start moving into the pigment stage of the terrain weathering. For this build, I decided to use 3 different pigments: burnt umber, European earth, and desert dust. And each one was going to serve a different purpose across the terrain. I actually brushed the pigment directly onto the face of the berm dry. I really wanted to build up some of the deeper earth tones and break up the lighter dusty colors that had built up from the airbrushing. This really helped add some depth and variation back into the berm. Finally, I moved on to desert dust pigment to really tie their entire scene together. And this was probably the most important pigment out of all 3, because this really creates that fine, powdery NTC dust look. I mainly focused on desert dust around the troop area, the vehicle position, the lower terrain. and these areas where the Stryker would naturally kick up and collect dust over time. For one of the final touches, I went back one last time with desert pigment and started weathering the Stryker. Because one thing that can completely break realism in a diorama is when the vehicle looks disconnected from the terrain it's sitting in. And out at NTC, these vehicles get absolutely covered in dust. The wheels, the lower hull, the ramp, the gear strapped to the outside, eventually everything starts taking on the same light dusty tan look from the desert. For the final touch on the entire diorama, I painted the outer edge of the insulation foam black to clean everything up and give the base a more finished presentation. After all the terrain work, the weathering, the pigments, and all the little details finally came together, it was finally time. This ended up becoming one of the most personal military dioramas I've built so far, because this scene isn't really about combat. It's about the moments in between, the downtime, the boredom, the exhaustion, the random humor that somehow always happened while living out in the field. The camp chairs sitting out in the dirt, the scattered gear around the troop area, the mortar crew working around the MCV, and of course, the two guys on an ammo crate trying to survive another day at NTC. If you've ever spent time in the Army, especially out in the Mojave Desert, you probably recognize at least a small piece of this scene, and that's really what I wanted this build to capture. Not just a Stryker, not just another mortar carrier, but the feeling of actually being there. The dust everywhere, the heat, the constant dirt, living outside the vehicle for weeks at a time. Because honestly, those are the memories that tend to stick with you the most. And with that, the NTC MCV diorama is finally complete. Oh yes, the black thing coming off the fuel cans we called donkey dicks. It was 15 years later that I realized the real name is the fuel filling spout. If you enjoyed this video as much as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment about maybe an experience you had. I'll see you in the next one.